Hi, I'm Chris Leonard from the Hub City Times, and we're here with our first episode of the Author's Corner, where we feature local authors or local subjects written by other authors. Today we have with us Cynthia Ruchti, and Cynthia has written about 30 books, something like that?
A little bit over that now, but yes, still going.
Okay, how did you get started?
This was not my intention, writing. A lot of people start their career when they're 3 or 4 and they start writing and think, oh, I just long to be a writer. When I grow up, I want to be an author. And for me, it was a different path. I was interested in many, many things. And it wasn't until really I had put 7 years in working in the chemistry lab at the Marshfield clinic and then I stayed home to take care of my small children at the time. During that time, I had an interest in writing creatively and took a couple of correspondence courses, and one thing led to another, and all of a sudden this writing bug bit me then in my adult life. And the last assignment for the correspondence courses that I was taking, just to kind of keep my brain fresh and my mind alert while I was caring for small children, the last assignment was to write a 15-minute scripted radio broadcast, and I had no interest whatsoever in that, and no training and no idea where to start. It's so much so that I procrastinated and put that assignment off for probably 8 or 9 months, and then eventually dragged it out just so I could get my certificate that I had passed the course. And within just a couple of months, there was an opportunity that came across my path that led me into writing a 15-minute scripted radio broadcast that was on the air for 33 years. And the local station in Millador carried the broadcast, and there were 48 stations across the country that carried the broadcast. At one time, toward the probably a little bit into the history of that radio broadcast, which was called The Heartbeat of the Home, it was on the air for 3 days a week, and then eventually 5 days a week, so Monday through Friday scripted broadcast.
So what was that first subject about?
The subject that I wrote about for the assignment was about banana bread and its wonderful smell, and that had very little impact on the lives of people at the time, and that was really what the broadcast was for. It was to really help to undergird and support people going through daily trials, everyday concerns, and then some deeper concerns too. So it was inspirational in nature. The first 7 or 8 minutes of it was an interaction, a scene from everyday life, a slice of life scene. And then we had a musical interlude, and then there would be thoughts after that. There would be nonfiction, considered nonfiction, that were applying some good life principles to that kind of a scene or situation. My radio partner was about 22 years older than I was. I wrote the stories, she edited them, she minored in English in college, so she was really good with a red pen. And throughout the course of all that time of working together, and she's still a dear, dear friend even today, but throughout the course of working together, we grew, and we grew in character, of course, as we hoped that the listeners would be too. But we tackled all kinds of topics and all kinds of subjects, anything that would relate to everyday life and what we face. So on one broadcast, she and I would be the on-air voices, and 2 college students. The next one, we might be she'd be a woman in a nursing home, and I'd be her caregiver. And the day after that, we'd be 2 friends out grocery shopping or taking our kids to the park. Every single episode was different and on a different topic. So I was writing these fictional scenes, and then the nonfiction devotional kind of thoughts that went with them for all that time, all those years. And that got me thinking then, when we drew to what we knew was going to have to be the retirement of that broadcast eventually, it got me thinking, can I write something longer than 8 minutes worth of writing? Could I write a novel? Could I write a nonfiction book? And what would it take to do that?
So, where did you draw inspiration for that first book, idea?
That's a great question. I studied and read and studied the craft and went to writers' conferences and joined a writers' organization so that I could learn, especially the craft of writing a novel, because it's not as simple as just having a story in mind, as any author will tell you. It's far deeper than that, more complex, layering the plots, layering the ideas, finding a theme and a core, and what's this book about, and what's it for? What's its reason for existing? Purely entertainment, which is a fine reason, but there are a lot of other things that enter into it as well. And for me, I wanted books that would matter to people. So I had been toying around with a lot of ideas, thinking I would write sweet little historical romances, perhaps, for the rest of my life. And after several dozen rejections, I thought maybe that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. Someone challenged me to write the book that would cost me the most emotionally to write. And I thought, I don't think I have a story. Oh, maybe I do. So I drew from an experience, and actually this was my first novel, They Almost Always Come Home. I drew from the experience of my husband, who almost didn't come home from his 2-week trip to Canada in 1999. He grew deathly ill when he was there out in the wilderness. And of course, I wanted him to come home, but that made me start that cycle of what ifs that every author deals with. What if he didn't come home? What if he hadn't come home? What if the wife didn't want him to come home? And what would have made her have that deep of a pain inside that would have been her reaction, as opposed to what my reaction was when I was very grateful to get my husband back home? So I explored that topic, and I took that path mentally of all those what ifs to lead me to what might be a novel that would be that would delve into some topics like when a couple doesn't necessarily grieve the same way, when a husband and wife are grieving differently, looking at the very same situation, that they're both going through it, but they're not going through it the same way. They're not responding or reacting the same way. And that was not only fascinating to me, but that was in 2010. And now, this past year, I was asked to co-write a book called Hit Hard, which is a nonfiction book about a couple who had a very traumatic experience with their son, who was injured on a football field in a concussion situation, and his brain trauma is something that they will live with for the rest of their lives. And the husband and the wife aren't approaching their grief over this, their ambiguous loss, in the same way. And I thought it was so interesting that came back around to be yet another topic that I would deal with from a different perspective this much later in my career.
And that book is out already?
That book is out. That book came out this summer. It's called Hit Hard.
Okay. Now I'm going to back up a little.
Sure.
You mentioned rejection before that first novel was published. Could you tell about the process and what kept you going and how it felt, like that first rejection letter? How did that make you feel?
Pretty terrible, but I think that's pretty normal that it would. And in fact, it was a gut punch in some ways, because every author would hope that by the time they send in a manuscript for consideration by someone else, whether that's a magazine article or a blog post that they send, a guest blog post, or a newspaper column, or anything that they've put their heart and soul into to write, they would expect they've already done the very hard work and it's ready to go and ready to go out to the public. And I know there are a lot of people who are intending to publish independently too, who get it to the point where they think it's the very best they could possibly do. But they don't know, will it be accepted or rejected by the readers too? So we all go through that. And at the time, I had no idea that rejection was going to be a part of my writing life all the time, my entire career. there are still projects that get rejected. Some of those projects get rejected before they even get formed into a proposal or get much farther than that first spark of an idea. And it might be my literary agent who says, no, that's never going to fly. Or it might be a publisher, or it might be at a conference. I'm thinking about a story idea in my mind, and someone else reports how they had the same kind of idea and it wasn't accepted for one reason or another. Rejection really does kind of rip your insides out. And the successful authors are the ones who can stay the course anyway, who can mourn, allow themselves to mourn for, they decide the time, maybe it's a whole day, maybe it's 3 days, maybe it's 3 minutes, but allow themselves to mourn that feeling of, oh, it didn't work, or it didn't work for reasons I don't know, and then get back up and look at their work again and see, all right, is there any truth to what they said, to what this editor said, or is there any reason I can see automatically now and intuitively that might have been the reason for why a project was rejected? It can be as simple as they just published one similar to that a while ago. It could be that that publishing house is just not the publishing house for that work. Or it could be the writing isn't where it needs to be, and I need to dig back in and figure out what it is I need to do to learn and grow so that I can communicate this story in its best possible way. So that first rejection, gut-wrenching. The second rejection, gut-wrenching, but at least I knew the procedure. I knew what that was like and what it meant. There are so many stories of very famous authors who have rooms full of rejections before they get their big break to get a book published. In fact, my very first novel, it was rejected by an agent that I was pitching my project to see if she would become my agent, and accepted by an editor on the same day.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of it has to do with personal preference, what that particular person or publisher or publishing house or editor can see in the work, whether it resonates with them personally or not. And then now I've kind of grown that soft heart and that tough skin that an author needs to be able to endure those kinds of things that happen in the writing world.
So to be an author, you have to be goal-oriented and stick to your job.
There are many authors who author things primarily for themselves, and that's okay. If that's the reason they get up every morning and spend 4 hours at their computer writing, just pouring out from their heart, or writing in a journal, or writing for their family, writing their family story for their family, that's a legitimate reason to write, to be an author. But those who want to take that to a different level and write for publication, yeah, there's this place where the resilience becomes very important. There's this time when writing, despite what's going on in the rest of your life, writing anyway, there's this realization that it's not an easy road. And if you want the road to be easy, quit now or write for some other reason. But if you want to write for publication, understanding that it is a road that is fraught with pitfalls and potholes, and sometimes it looks like a Marshfield street in early spring, that there's some repair work that needs to be done, and those who can rebound from rejections and stick it out, and instead of tossing away the idea because it's not resonating like it should, digging in and finding out why, and then making it resonate like we need to. Because ultimately, when we write, we're writing to communicate. We're writing to communicate something. We are the one, in essence, speaking through our written words, but there's a listener on the other end, the reader. And if it's not hitting the reader, and the first reader is sometimes that editor, if it's not hitting them like it does us, just like a husband and wife would, we figure out different ways to communicate so that the communication is getting through rather than just what we wanted to say.
So how many days a week are you writing, and what kind of schedule do you keep?
Oh, I'm the wrong person to ask that question to, primarily because I have my hands in a lot of endeavors that have to do with writing. I'm writing every day, but not necessarily writing on my novels or my nonfiction books either, because I'm also a literary agent now. Sometimes I'm writing for other people's projects. I'm helping them develop their paragraphs or their characters or their plot or their proposal. And many times I'm writing for the writing organizations that I'm involved in, and sometimes I'm writing contracts, and sometimes I'm writing press releases, and my fingers are busy all the time on the keyboard, but it's not always the creative kind of writing that I need to do when I'm sitting down to write a novel or nonfiction. So my day is varied, and I work from home. And my kids are grown and gone now. And when I say gone, I mean they're in Marshfield, and I'm outside of Marshfield. So I have the privilege of having my 3 kids and 6 grandkids very close to home, which is wonderful and a great gift. But in this work at home environment, I often will spend part of my day marketing. I'll spend another part of my day working with my literary clients. I'll spend another part of my day researching the books that I'm working on. But I have never been able to be the kind of person who can sit down at the computer at 8 o'clock in the morning, get up from the computer at 4 in the afternoon and say, okay, there, I'm done and I got my word count in. Rather, I'm scattered, and not scattered in a disorganized way, but called upon to need to interrupt my intended schedule often in order to meet the needs of the other things that I'm involved in. When I'm really working on a tight deadline, I kind of have to shut out the world and just really plow in. And then those days might be days where I'm writing fast and furiously and then rewriting the next day. But those who have developed a schedule, and maybe you're one, but those who have developed a schedule who sit down to the computer and they're able to write and just devote themselves to writing for a specific set period of time during the day, I so admire them and their lives and their productivity. I'm working, as we said, on book, I think it's 32 or 33 right now, a book that's due in March that isn't finished yet, but it will be. I won't miss the deadline, but it'll be some fast and furious writing over the next couple of months, too, as I complete that project. I have found over the course of time in talking to lots of writers that everybody's schedule is different, and they all work as long as they work for you. I have friends who are working around a full-time job. I have friends who are working around having young children at home, and their only time for writing is between 9 and midnight. That works for them, and it's a system that we just have to develop the patterns that not only will work for us, but that we're comfortable enough with, so we don't shame ourselves into thinking this isn't how I should be writing. If I'm a real writer, I should be spending 8 hours a day on this, and that works for very few people.
I think the biggest challenge as a writer is probably being on deadline and not being in the mood to write.
Yes.
Because there are those days where you just don't feel like it, but you have to get it done.
So true. I can't remember now if it was Faulkner, but someone said, it wasn't Faulkner. Someone said very poignantly, I only write when I'm inspired, but I'm inspired at 9 o'clock every morning. I have to be. And that was his position toward that. But I used to wait for inspiration too, because I thought that would be my best writing. But oftentimes it's just the writing itself. It's the process of writing itself. It's getting the hands moving, or even writing longhand. It's getting a scene on paper, even if it's not chapter 1. But there's this vibrant scene in your mind for novelists, and if I can just get that down, or even get a couple of snatches of sentences or phrases down, at the time, that will start the ball rolling. That will prime the pump. And yes, you're right, especially when writing for newspapers, magazines, online services where the deadlines come pretty close together. It's an interesting thing because we think and ponder a lot. Staring out the window is a great task for a writer, but then the day comes when we have to turn in the words. So yes, we have to write whether we feel inspired or not, but often the inspiration will come during the process of the writing, and that's fun. That makes it fun.
So, as a published author, I'm sure you have people come up to you and ask for advice on how to get started. What do you tell those people that are just starting out, they have a great story idea, they're inspired to write, they've always wanted to write? How do you tell them to get started?
I love this question because it's not asked often enough. Oftentimes people will think that to get started just means getting it down on paper, and there's so much more to it than that. The first thing I say is, if you can, get yourself to the best high quality writers conference you can. Because you'll not only learn so much about the craft of writing, but you'll also understand everything else that goes around it. You'll get a feel for editing and what other people's stories have taken them through, their writer stories, what it has brought them through, and how they conquered some of the hurdles that they were dealing with. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know until we're confronted with it, and that may be in a book on the craft of writing, where until someone points it out to us, we don't realize that our point of view ideas are real wiggly, and we need to have that solidly down, or that our plot is great, but it has no point at the end or resolution at the end. But those things we don't necessarily know until we've really dug into the training of it. Jokingly, I sometimes say, if someone comes up and says, I'd like to write a novel, I jokingly say, great, do you have 12 years? And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it helps the person on the other end to understand it's not that by next week I can be paying my mortgage because I have a book idea today. In fact, there are very few authors who ever can pay their mortgage with what they make off of their writing. It's not a get-rich-quick idea, and it's not a get-good-quick idea either. The process of writing over time, the interaction with other writers, studying the craft, learning. One of the most prolific writers in the genre in which I write is Francine Rivers, multi-million selling author, not in dollars but in copies of her books out there still now, prolific author. And famous in the circles in which she travels. She still will be sitting in the back of the room at writers' conferences, in the workshops, taking notes furiously, because after all this time and all those books, she still knows that there's much yet to learn.
Okay, so this is your first book, correct? Okay, so when you got your copy of this, can you describe what that feeling was like?
There is a story that goes with that. My mother was at the House of the Dove in her final days. We thought it was going to be the final couple of days, and it turned out to be that she was at the House of the Dove for 9 months before she finally passed away from congestive heart failure. And this book was in the works. She was someone who had invested in my writing life, who wanted so much for me to see my dream fulfilled in having my first novel published. She had been one to send me to writers' conferences because I couldn't afford to go. She'd been a cheerleader for me for so long, and now here she was in her final days. And I knew that that book was to release in May of that year, and she so much wanted to hang on until then. But we got to just about this time of year, and we could tell that she was going downhill fast. On the 1st of February, the advanced reader copies of They Almost Always Come Home arrived. I took my copy to her at House of the Dove, and I said, here it is, Mom. And she held it in her hands, and she clutched it to her chest and said, oh, my book. And then she said, I mean, our book. And she told everybody who came in the room to visit her. She was lucid almost to the end. And she told everybody about it. She kept it on a tray table beside her bedside. And it was such a moment. I was so grateful that she got to see the fruit of her labor in that first book. And it was within 2 weeks that she passed away. The staff at House of the Dove said we could just tell that she was ready to go then. She was ready to let go. And so there's such a tenderness in my heart toward this, and also just for the idea of those who have come around me and around other authors, and I want to be that for other authors to come alongside and be the cheerleader and be the one who says, here, I'll send you to the writers' conference if you can't afford to go, or I'll make sure you get to the writers' retreat, or you can't afford printer ink this month, let me take care of that for you so that I can help you on your journey. Or maybe the input that I will have is just to pray for that author and pray that the path opens up and they'll be able to get where they need to go with their writing, or where their writing is intended to go. So there's a story with almost every book. There's a little part of me in almost everything that I've written. And then again, coming around in nonfiction, as my parents age, are these reflections on watching our parents age. My father passed away quickly in the middle of the night from a heart attack too many years ago. And with my mother, it was a very long, slow process. And both ways are hard. But taking a look at these things that happen to us in life and finding ways to put them into story or to weave them into books that can be of benefit to other people is part of the joy of why I do what I do.
How many nonfiction and how many fiction books do you have?
There's a balance there. I didn't set out to do that, but I realized looking back that when I was writing for radio, I was writing both fiction and nonfiction for all those broadcasts. So it was a much more natural leap than it would be for some other authors who have one direction that they would like to go. Or, for instance, if there's someone who loves to write mysteries and thrillers, and then they decide instead they're going to write cookbooks, it's going to be a learning curve. There'll be a learning curve there in the middle. But for me, it was much more natural to write both fiction and nonfiction. I write devotionals for Guideposts organization and have been writing for them since 2014, every year since 2014. And then some other books that have been of particular interest on a nonfiction front, and I usually tell people that the nonfiction books I write are the books I'd like to hand to the characters in my novels, because they really need that help, whatever the nonfiction book is. So there's a book called Ragged Hope, Surviving the Fallout of Other People's Choices. Almost all of us know somebody who has someone who's paying a high price for somebody else's bad decision. And a book called Tattered and Mended, The Art of Healing the Wounded Soul, that the problems and the trials that we go through can be seen as just destructive, or we can look deeper and see that there's some kind of art that's coming out of this, the hard things that we go through. So those are the kinds of things I'd want to hand to my characters in the books that I write. I often set my books in the Midwest because I love the Midwest. I'm familiar with it. And there's so much charm in the Midwest. There's so much that has to do with our work ethic or the people we are, the characters we are, but also places like Stillwater, Minnesota, where I set one of my Christmas novellas, and Algoma, Wisconsin, where another Christmas novella was set. As Water's Gone By is a novel that's set on Madeline Island, and love to have the opportunity then also to go visit some of those places so that I have the research I need in order to be able to write about them with accuracy and in ways that I can capture the smells and the flavors and the feeling in the air, and things like if people have driven to Door County and they've driven to Algoma and they see what that's like to be driving through this little tiny town, and all of a sudden, whoa, there's the lake in front of them, that if they don't stop at the stop sign, they'll be right in the lake. It's those kinds of things are the details that I love to work into the books that I'm writing about.
And then you can write off your trip too.
And then write off the trip. That doesn't hurt anything. My husband and I had a trip to Seattle and stayed on the Puget Sound for a while, and that trip was related to a speaking event where I was asked to speak. And we took a couple extra days then and stayed at this home that was right on Puget Sound, and I thought, oh, there's a book in there somewhere, and a write-off. So yes, that's true.
Did you ever write your historical romance?
You know, it's interesting that of the three that probably will never see the light of day, the fourth one I was able to incorporate into a book that had three different time periods, three different eras in that book. And I got to dabble with a little bit of that historical part, and then more modern history around the time of the Korean War, and then current day. And there were three women from those different eras that all showed up in the same book. So I did get to experiment a little bit, and who knows what I'll be writing next month or next year or the year after that.
And okay, so the first one came out in 2010?
Yes.
So what was the time period between the first and the second book?
I had another release in 2010 that was on a different topic. For a while, in order to fit 32 books into 10 years, this 10-year time frame now that we're in 2020, there had to be 2 or 3 that were being released every year. I think the highest year was 4 books released, but a lot of new authors or new writers don't understand that many times, especially with traditional publishing, we will have a contract for a book, but the book itself won't release for a year and a half or 2 years. There's so much in the process of that. So sometimes the work that I did on these 4 books might have been done a year ago or 2 years ago, or maybe even longer than that. But currently, I have a nonfiction project that I'll get started on as soon as I turn in this novel book, and then working on marketing for the books that are out now or releasing soon too.
So to back up a little, what was the time period between starting to write the first book and it being published?
Great question. I started studying the art of writing fiction in 2002. I got my contract in 2008, and then the book released in 2010. So then that process means that now once a writer, I sometimes tell writers who aren't published yet, enjoy this phase, because there will come a day when you don't have that freedom anymore. You'll be working on multiple projects at once, and you'll be marketing one and setting up the publicity for another one, and fielding reader letters from another, and proposing a book that you want to have come out in 2 years from now, all at the same time. I think it's probably good that I have enough ADD in me that I can flip from one thing to another, because that's certainly a part of most writers' lives. Very few writers who get to the stage of having been published by a traditional publisher, very few can have the luxury of saying, I will write one book every 2 years, and please bring me an iced tea. And the rest of us are in the trenches and doing the work and the hard work, and then sharing in that marketing and the publicity aspect as well. Or interviews, which is another great part of it.
So your most recent book, do we have that up here?
Yes, this one released just this last fall, which is called Miles from Where We Started. This one I experimented with this principle of a millennial couple that was right on the verge of their first anniversary and right on the verge of calling it quits. And they were forced into a 3,000-mile, 3-week trip in a micro camper with a 11-year-old foster boy, troublemaker. And during that time period, when they traveled the country and they met people along the way who had been a little farther down the road of life than they had, who could speak into their lives, but when they really were forced to take a look at the strengths in one another and what marriage really is, and not a happy feeling necessarily. It's about commitment. And during that process where they were gaining that bit by bit, but having all kinds of hysterical adventures along the way, they came across people who are the kind of people who have spoken wisdom into my life too through the years. But that one is called Miles from Where We Started. That came out in the fall, and then my next book releases in June. That novel is called Afraid of the Light. It's a story of a woman who counsels, a psychologist who counsels people with hoarding disorders. And
wow.
And it's very interestingly, she has a podcast where she tries to speak to the families of those who have hoarding disorders, and also help those with the disorder understand their own disease better, their own compulsion and addiction better. And it was a fascinating story to research. The main character soon begins to realize that she's been hoarding emotions just like her clients have been hoarding things. And kind of all of us are hoarding something. We just have to figure out what that is and what we're going to do about it.
So where can people get your books?
They are online. They can contact me and get information about the books through my website, which is cynthiarookde.com, or alternately, they can get to me through my tagline website, which is hemmedinhope.com. That's an easier one to remember than how to spell this last name that hardly anybody can pronounce, but you did beautifully. Thank you. And
I had a good teacher.
And they're either in traditional bookstores and independent bookstores, or they can be ordered through those bookstores, and they're available online, any of the online sources.
Okay.
Barnes & Noble or Amazon.
And your website again?
My website is hemmedinhope.com, or Cynthia Rookde, that's RUCHTI.com.
Okay, anything that you want to add that I didn't go over? Or?
Some people might wonder why Hemmed in Hope would be the title of my website. My tagline is, I can't unravel, I'm hemmed in hope. And that kind of is a theme that comes out in any of the books that I write. And it's a theme I want to live in my life as well.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a great joy, great pleasure.
On behalf of Cynthia Rookde, I'm Chris Leonard from Hub City Times. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.